to talk about the economics, and I was really happy to see Pat put an emphasis on profitability. There's lots of long-term science that we have to do on all these crops, and I work on things other than walnuts. And so let me say it's important to have scientists thinking 5 and 10 and 20 and 40 years down the road, because that's what's required to get to have the industry be sustainable in the long haul. At the same time, from the point of view of an individual grower, or for that matter, an exporting company or a marketing company, you got to make it past next year and the year after that. And I'm not going to talk so much about the very short run, but I will give a flavor of particularly the demand side. So let me get started. Motivation here. I'm going to talk about the economic outlook with an emphasis on exports. And this is not the talk. I might otherwise have given a talk about farm costs and production issues, what's going on with fertilizer prices, farm labor, water issues, of course, regulations related to water. Those are topics for a different presentation. If you have questions on them, I may deal with them very quickly, but probably I'll refer you to some other work we've done. Of course, about 2/3 of California walnuts are exported. It goes up a little bit now and then. And certainly exports have supported the economic growth of the industry, which has grown over the years, as it has for the other tree nuts. So, and it's easy to it's natural to think of walnuts in the context of the other tree nuts and the other crops in California. Walnuts, we probably export about 25 or 30% of the value of California agricultural production. And those are numbers that we put out from my research group. And we do the official work for the state of California. There's no real data there, so it's a matter of working through lots of disparate sources to get an estimate of exports for California produced crops. So walnuts, the export intensity of walnuts is about double California agriculture as a whole. And so it's crucially important. And often when I talk about trade, I emphasize imports and exports, but there's no reason to talk about imports of walnuts. It's of trivial importance. So we'll talk about exports. And let me say, exports obviously depend on walnut costs and quality and product characteristics, things Pat was just talking about. But I'm going to emphasize the other stuff. So, if there's no water to grow walnuts, we're not going to export many, or it's going to be too expensive, and we'll price ourselves out of the market. But for now, I want to talk about other things. And I'm going to start actually with something that's not strictly exports, but it is related, and that's the inflation, interest rate, costs, demand side issues there, because I think there's enough macroeconomics going on right now that I should probably speak to it before I get strictly to the export side. I have a number of slides on walnut trade patterns that I won't have time to go through all of them. So I plan to put them on whatever website or make them available to anybody that wants them, and I'll send them to Carrie and others. And you can get these data slides. They're recent historical data on the trade patterns. And then I'll speak to the Ukraine issue briefly. Many of you know Ukraine is a major competitor with California, not as big as Chile and China, which is what I'll spend more time talking about. But I think it's reasonable to want to get to think a little bit about Ukraine in that context. So first, talking about interest rates, I'm not going to show you a bunch of data here. We've just gone through a long period of very low interest rates. And when people talk about, for example, the tree nut industry in California, they often forget that. They say, oh, the export demand is good, people buy it. Almonds have this feature, walnuts have that feature, pistachios are fortunate for this or that. And people sometimes forget that without low interest rates, nobody invests something in a crop that's not going to pay off for a decade. So you've got to have low interest rates to make sense of these things. And we are in a period right now where things may change, and it's worth thinking that through. Why the pandemic, in a sense, is behind this, though the pandemic's not directly the cause of the inflation we're facing. Some of us, some disruption. Certainly, there's some reaction to pandemic disruption, but a big chunk of it is a government effort to get us through the pandemic. And part of that was massive government spending. This is not a political R versus D thing. Both R's and D's in Washington, D.C. agreed to have massive government spending. And then on top of that, the Federal Reserve said we will accommodate that spending by taking government bonds and making other accommodations to businesses from the Federal Reserve. What that means is now, and you've all read about this in the paper, the Fed, which means something like the national bank, is going to raise interest rates for everybody. And they affect the banking system, and the banking system raises rates for everybody. And it looks like the government is going to, whether they like it or not, are likely to reduce spending increases. Federal government never reduces spending, but they may reduce spending increases. And that may, employers are already struggling, and one thing that may do is make more workers available. A little less tight labor market, and perhaps a little less alternative income to people, meaning more people are likely to work. But that's not the big part of it. The big part of it is watching what happens to the inflation rate, and for the walnut industry directly, what happens to interest rates. So at the same time, it's clear there's regulations aren't going away. If anything, they're getting more stringent, not just in California, but nationwide. For some industries, nationwide regulatory things are good for California, sort of your competitors keeping up with you. But in walnuts, there's no competitors in the United States, so that's not an issue. But higher interest rates are likely to shape the longer term investments in walnuts and the other tree nuts and other industries that have very long payoffs. It's natural for the walnut industry to be conservative then about long-term investments. And it may mean for that and other reasons, in a sense, a slower growth or no growth in the acreage for the industry. And that goes along with water or other regulatory things. I'm not a macroeconomic forecaster. I'm not going to do any. I think it's a pretty unreliable business to be in, and I'm sort of happy that it's not my field. I'm going to show you a few slides that some of you see. I like putting this on an index. So 2011 is equal to 1. And what we've seen is acreage going up fairly, this is bearing acreage going up fairly steadily, almost 50% over this decade. Production up and down, that's what we expect. And yield, not, up a bit, down a bit. We know that yields go up and down, but no obvious growth in yield. If we had a longer time horizon, we'd see some growth. What about revenue? So this only goes to 2020 because we don't have a price for the 2021 marketing year. That is the crop that was produced in 2021. But we do have that through 2020, which of course was a big production year. But production value goes along. What you can see here is unit value. This is in price per ton. You could put it in a price per pound if you want to. But unit value moves up and down with the size of the crop. It moves down with big crops, and total farm production value is down. And if you remember the prior slide, we had prices or quantities going up by 40% or so, and we have prices falling by 60%. And that leaves the total value of the production lower in 2020 than it had been, it right as low as it had been in each of the other big crop years. 2021 is a bit smaller crop, so from that alone, we would expect prices to be a bit higher. And I don't think this adds anything. Here, this is the U.S. terminal values from the Ag Marketing Service. I don't like these numbers very much, but they're a flavor of the domestic market. Whoops. And what you see there is I summarize the average marketing year, including the first 6 months in the domestic market, starting with September, where there's a little bit marketed, and prices really took off in the domestic market for 2 or 3 months. So this year, so far, the domestic price is higher. Notice it came down in January and February. This goes, the 21-22 marketing year goes through February. This is Agricultural Marketing Service data, and it's about the best information we have from the domestic market. What this slide does is show you how the export unit values, this is in-shell value of market total exports in a marketing year in value divided by exports in a marketing year in quantity, how that relates to the farm gate unit values in those years. They go up and down together, but you get a year like 2019, where the farm gate value held up, even though the export unit values fell. Where we are in 2021 so far for the exports, and this is only the first 4 months because we don't have the last month we have for export data. This is from federal values. Those of you in the export business have better data than I have because you have your own company's records. I don't see those, but what we have here is the national statistics on average export values. And if anything, that doesn't look good for the farm values. That is, this year's export values, even with a smaller crop, don't look particularly good. But we'll see how the rest of the year plays out. And remember, this is the part of the year where we have typically big quantities exported. And I'll show you that in a couple of slides. So who are the competitors? This is walnut production. Of course, China's always been a big producer of walnuts. That isn't news. Chile, a decade ago, was a pretty small producer of walnuts, and it's grown rapidly compared to the rest of the world, compared to the Ukraine, which is also a major. So there's 6 lines here in production, and the whole rest of the world is now about the size of Chile when it comes to exports. There's a lot of, and the European Union, which was a substantial walnut producer back back a decade ago, when the U.S. was smaller than it is now, 50% smaller than it is now, the European Union hasn't really grown at all, and has moved into being a major importer of walnuts. So what about exports? The European Union falls into the rest of the world now, and where we see is the U.S. still in the 21-22. This is projections for the marketing year from the USDA. So this is October's projections. This is not realization in this 2021 year. Ukraine is substantial. Rest of the world is very small. And you'll see the rest of the world is really a major walnut. And the big growth here is the steady growth of Chile and the very recent rapid growth of China. And many of you know what's behind this. In the Chile, it's both quality and the growth of their production, steadily making them a tougher and tougher export competitor for the United States. And in China, it's probably a matter of expanding orchards and expanding quality at the same time. And as far as we can tell, with lots of government support, but I say that by saying as far as we can tell, because everything is murky in China when it comes to government support, particularly for capital intensive industries like walnuts, so that you can have the banking system in China is controlled by the government. Now, the government controlled banks don't always make good investments, so it's not clear there's any profitability in these walnuts, particularly at the prices they sell for. But so far, at least for many industries, including big investment industries like real estate in China, real estate investments in China, banks have made massive investments that have been terrible investments. They've lost bundles. But that won't necessarily, once the trees are planted and growing and producing, that may not change the exports. The fact that they're losing money and companies are going bankrupt doesn't mean the trees are yanked. And so that is a problem for U.S. exports. Yeah, so let me just speak to Ukraine. Production going up gradually, not big relative to the U.S., but when production goes, exports go up. Consumption is small relative to exports in the Ukraine, not as extreme as Chile. Ukraine is a much bigger country than Chile. They do have consumers there. As I understand it, and some of you would know better than I do, Ukraine used to sell mostly to Russia. Whatever residual there is left in Ukraine isn't going to Russia this year, I would predict. But, you know, there's things go across. It's a long border. And even in a time of global tension, let me just say it's a long border. But still, one would expect those Ukraine walnuts are either going to have a very hard time getting out of the country, these exports. At the same time, there will be diversion away from the Russian market. That's at least my expectation right now. But the most important thing about Ukraine is absolute uncertainty about what the hell is going to be going. And I'd be very interested in hearing from some of you in the Q&A period, if we have a few minutes, about what your experience is there. So I don't need to summarize consumption. I'll leave this in the slides for people to look at later. Imports, again, the European Unions and the rest of the world are the big ones here. On the imports, we pulled out European Union, and Bill Matthews, who I work with, helped a lot on these slides. And you see, let me talk about some monthly data, because there we can see what this is, shelled and in-shelled separately. And you can see right after the beginning of the marketing year, November, December of every year, you get a spike, particularly in the in-shell market. Much more muted spike this year than usual. And if we go to, let me skip down to the monthly by destination. This is the U.S. exports by destination. We had a huge spike this year to the European Union, and bigger than in the past, even bigger than last year, where we had a sort of a double spike in the European Union, and we'll see if we get that double jump in this coming year. But the Turkish market, and we know that there's absolute chaos in Turkey economically with exchange rates and everything else. They are not a reliable market, and we lost some of that market relative to previous years. Last year was lousy in Turkey, and this year is no better. And it collapsed fairly quickly, even given that spike. But I would say relative to last year, the biggest worry is the rest of the world. Now, last year we had a great big crop to get rid of. So these are quantities. Exports quantities are going to be bigger last year. But we certainly didn't see a rest of world spike like one may have hoped. Maybe that'll come back. Again, this is just the first 4 months through December. And some of you know what's going on in January and February. I don't. This is export values by destination. Prices, you can see here's the European Union up to close to $70 million a month for the peak months there. Let me get to some final remarks and then open it up for questions. And I think I've left enough time for some questions here. Clearly challenging times, 2021, 22, smaller crop to sell. We may see higher prices. Certainly Rabobank, for example, when they released something a couple of weeks ago, expect to see higher prices. And they're as credible as any. You know, you don't take that to your banker, but it's, you know, they're no more likely to be wrong than any of the rest of us. But this year has a long way to go to know where the market year prices are going to be. But even if prices are up this year, what about the next big crop? And there will be more big crops. So this is challenging times, not just for walnuts, but for the other crops that compete with walnuts for water and land. So when I say walnuts face challenging times perhaps because interest rates are going up, water is not going to be more robustly available, certainly not this year. So what's going to happen to walnuts? Well, almonds and a few other crops are also facing fairly challenging times. Some of them facing more challenging times because of water. And it depends on where you are. My guess is rice is in a position to release some water this year in Northern California. Cotton prices are way up, and we'll see whether they're willing to release some water this year, like they did in last summer. China and Chile do face their own economic turmoil issues. Chile is facing political problems like they haven't had in the past. They're facing a change in economic policy. They have had a very business friendly economic policy for a decade, 2 decades. The current government in Chile is anti-economics. They're anti-business. We'll see what happens. That doesn't change the amount of walnuts that are already out in the orchards. It doesn't mean that those walnuts aren't going to be exported. But it does mean going forward, Chile is facing, at least for a while, facing a government that is pretty hostile to agricultural business. China has different kind of turmoil. China's not growing like it was. China's labor availability is shrinking. Their government also has discovered that throwing money at failing businesses isn't a good business for the government. So they're facing some challenges there. Again, that doesn't do anything to a bunch of 5 or 10-year-old walnut trees. Those trees are still going to be in the ground almost surely. Whether they replace those or not is another question in China. I would say in the short run, Ukraine is a wild card. They're big enough in walnuts to matter, but we just don't know what's going to happen. At least I certainly don't. Disruption, but which way will it? I see a typo. This should say any remaining exports to Russia are likely to be diverted. I would expect that to be true. And how long the disruption will last, I don't see Ukraine being linked to Russia anytime soon. I don't see Russia taking over Ukraine, but you know, I'm not going to try to predict a global military policy. But it does mean turmoil, and the walnut industry faces several year horizon where things may stabilize, but they're going to stabilize well below boom year prices, and that'll dampen growth. But of course, you know, these predictions have to be taken with a grain of salt. Who knows what the next weather will be or the next global conflict will be. So let me leave it at there and see if there are any questions. I don't see a solution to profitability issues for walnuts, but maybe some of you do. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see if there's any questions, if that's all right. Well, let me leave it just like it is in case there are questions. So somebody will have to read the questions to me because I don't. Wait a second. I see a couple things in the Q&A. Yeah. So somebody asked about the export value and the grower return. And so let me get back to that slide, and I'll show you what was on this. This is these are export unit values and farm, which is an in-shell combination of shelled and unshelled walnuts, and it's ready to be shipped. So that's what's on the blue line. And so there's a lot happens between the farm value and the port value. This is on a boat ready to go, and so there's a lot happens between the two. And every grower that I've ever known in every industry I've ever known said, "Gee, the guy who I sell it to, you must be making all the money because they're getting a higher price than I'm getting." All I can say is both businesses are really tough businesses, and if you think there's guaranteed profit in the export business, that's not what I hear from the exporters anyway. There's then a question that says, what about tariffs? And I didn't get enough to talk about there. Yeah, I should have. Let me say this. I was optimistic that when we had a new administration, they said they were bound and determined in throwing out everything the last administration did. And they did a lot of that. What they didn't do it is on trade policy. And I'm going to be very blunt. I am disgusted. That's a very strong word. I'm disgusted with the trade policy. This administration has basically continued the tariffs that the last administration had, which meant the retaliatory tariffs have stayed in place for things like walnuts. So we still face the same kind of walnut tariffs that we faced from the previous administration. And it's true for other products too. The same with the WTO. One reason we had an expansion in California agricultural trade, walnuts included, has been that the United States has had good trade agreements. So competing with Chile, for example, Chile has trade agreements with everybody. They're in every trade agreement you can imagine. That was the policy of the prior governments, probably not the policy of the current government. So we're facing Chilean products that go into India, say tariff-free, and we're facing tariffs. So that is a challenge, and I don't see this administration changing that. They just haven't. Sometimes they talk a good game, but watch what they do, and they just, they're busy doing other stuff. I guess that's the kindest thing you could say. Someone asked about my there's a question: should the Walnut Board be working on trying to have the administration understand that opening markets around the world are good things for the walnut industry? And the answer is absolutely yes. And to the extent that you can work with other industries and work with the California Department of Agriculture to get the message to the the current administration in Washington, we need open markets, that'd be great. And the last administration didn't listen. That's very clear. But I think this administration would be willing to listen at least, and there may be some opportunities there. In terms of projecting prices, if you haven't seen the Rabobank projections, seem as plausible as any. That is slightly above last year, continuing out, and they wiggle up and down as you think. We have big crops or small crops, prices wiggle around a little, but not very much above current prices. So if you were to say to me, gee, how about 70 cents a pound or 80 cents a pound, I wouldn't argue with you. But if you said 70, I wouldn't argue. And if you said 80, I wouldn't argue. And I think people could try to be precise about things like that, but the answer is nobody really knows. If somebody tells you they really know what prices are going to be 2 or 3 years from now, first thing I'd do is hide my wallet, because I wouldn't trust that person if they told me they knew things. 'Cause I wouldn't trust that person. If they told me they knew things. 'Cause I wouldn't trust that person if they told me they knew things. 'Cause I wouldn't trust that person. 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 'Cause Yeah. Um, Bob Beatty says growers don't know what the margins are or what the costs of production are for exporters, and that's true. And frankly, neither does the exporter really know. They don't know what's going to happen in the markets that they may commit, particularly in an uncertain period like now. Ask people how they did when they had contracts in Chile, or excuse me, in Turkey when the Turkish lira collapsed. You know, the export business is a very tough business, and I don't want to make light of that. Is somebody making it a profit? Probably so. They certainly hope to. Um, but in the case of walnuts, it's not as though there's only 2 or 3 companies exporting walnuts. There's a lot of competition in that business, and they're all looking to compete. I will say there are industries that have attempted to put an export cartel in place. That is, export as a single industry. That never works, but there are industries that try it, and you could think maybe California could try to do that. But the problem is California doesn't, we're the largest world exporter of walnuts, but we don't dominate the world. Maybe we did a little more 10 years ago than we do now. But given competition from Chile and China, especially, it is hard to see what the U.S. can do in a sense to get bigger prices in the export market.
Okay. Well, I think we need to, for the interest of time, we need to move on. But thank you so much, Dr. Sumner, for the presentation and answering all majority of the questions. So there is only one left. I think it's you answer partly, but if you don't mind to answer that by chat or with that Q&A section, that would be appreciated. The last one, and with